Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. Today we're learning about the Every Student Succeeds Act and what that might mean for the future of science education.
So a science teacher that goes to their principal 5 years ago and says, hey, I want to do a coding class, or I want to do something hands-on and learning, the principal can say, well, you know what? We're only being measured for math and reading in our school. We got to focus on those subjects, and maybe we're not doing so well there. Now that science teacher gets to go to the principal and say, you know what? We can now use federal dollars to support a robotics team or a hands-on learning activity or something that underlines NGSS.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
Today we'd like to welcome James Brown to our show. We have a lot of questions about the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we think James can help us out. James?
Well, good morning. I'm James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition, which is an alliance of a little more than 700 business, professional, and education organizations devoted to making STEM education a public policy priority.
Okay. We've kind of been in this era of No Child Left Behind. Dale and I might refer to it as Nickelby, but that era is over, and we have some new federal education law coming into play, the Every Student Succeeds Act. What's the acronym? How do we pronounce that?
Well, so everybody in Washington calls it ESSA, but
ESSA?
You're very much right that the No Child Left Behind era is over, and now we're in the ESSA era.
Okay, so that goes into effect this fall, and many science teachers, including myself, science administrators, we don't know a whole lot about this law yet. So what are some things that we should know about ESSA?
Well, everybody that lived through the No Child Left Behind era can remember the controversies that law evoked by bringing about more federal control over education. ESSA is moving in the opposite direction. So what the new education law does is place in the hands of states and districts a lot more decision-making authority about their accountability systems and how they spend federal dollars and, by extension, their state dollars and their priorities. And that has a lot of implications for science education and STEM education because it gives states a lot more opportunities to make decisions that can benefit those subjects.
Okay, so this is more state control then, and that's been more of a national control in the past. Is that right?
So the pendulum has swung back and forth across our history, and No Child Left Behind was clearly a swing in the other direction. The new education law basically corrected that overreach in the sense that a lot of decisions are now at the state level, and importantly, a lot more decisions are at the district level. So districts have a lot of discretion with how they will spend federal dollars that were at the state level or the federal level under No Child Left Behind. And you're right that a lot of folks at the on the ground do not yet know what's in this law, because it's putting a lot of it's telling them these decisions are up to you. That's a very different mentality and a very different way of making decisions than most people who've been in the education system over the last 20 or 25 years are used to.
We're maybe not ready for that.
Well, responsibility, right? All these states have to step up, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, this is literally a situation where the state education department, their role in complying with No Child Left Behind was essentially a compliance role. Comply with the law, make sure we don't get in trouble. And they had the same issue when they went through the whole waiver process in the latter years of the Obama administration, where they were negotiating with the Department of Education. Now they have to all submit plans under this new education law, and if those plans comply with the letter of the law, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, has largely been approving those plans. And that leaves a lot of decisions up to the states and the districts about things, for example, of including science in the accountability system. 17 out of the 25 states that have put in plans so far have proposed increasing the prominence of science in their accountability system, which is a big signal of the priority for STEM education, because that's going to drive resource decisions, it's going to drive the hiring of educators, the allocation of classroom materials, and it's going to make it easier for kids to spend more time learning science.
Oh,
get your STEM coach resumes updated is what you're saying.
Well, and imagine this, right? So a science teacher that goes to their principal 5 years ago and says, hey, I want to do a coding class, or I want to do something hands-on and learning, the principal can say, well, you know what? We're only being measured for math and reading. in our school. We got to focus on those subjects, and maybe we're not doing so well there. Now that science teacher gets to go to the, if it's a good NSTA member that's briefed up on this topic, they're going to go to their principal and say, hey, you know what? We can now use federal dollars to support a robotics team or a hands-on learning activity or something that underlines NGSS.
Oh, okay. Now, I saw a map recently about like which states have started the process, and there were a lot of states that haven't even submitted yet. Is that true?
Well, so a little more than half the states have now submitted their plans. They have to get them all in by the end of September, and there will probably be a few states that are stragglers. But for the most part, there are a couple of exceptions where the department has sort of sent their plan back. Like Michigan is the most recent example where the department has said it's not detailed enough to meet the requirements of the law. But most of the states expect to have their plans approved by the department by the end of this year. So this law will go into effect next school year fully.
And what is the role of teachers listening to the show? Is there something that they can do to help advocate for science education?
Well, between now and the end of the year, it's really important. Well, let me answer those two questions separately. Yeah. So what teachers can do, in the analogy that I just said, is teachers need to be asking their leaders. Those leaders need to be asking the state education department to prioritize science, to prioritize STEM in the plans that follow under ESSA. So the state submits a plan, it gets approved, and then the state will issue guidelines to every district that will set priorities and requirements for applying to different sources of federal funding. So the states can prioritize science and STEM, so can the districts, and that's up to them to make those decisions. So science teachers have an incredibly important role in influencing those details and making sure they're asking for a share of resources and priority for their activities within the schools, and maybe getting past this notion that the federal law is really only focused on math and reading, that it can be focused on other things.
So wait,
and what? Go ahead.
Well, that means a school district, a state could also not put enough emphasis on science too. Is that correct?
Well, that's possible, and there undoubtedly will be some states and districts that do that. But the law doesn't. It's no. Let me put it this way. It's certainly no worse than No Child Left Behind, where states could ignore science, right, because they could say it's math and reading are the only focus. Yeah, some states may not go that direction, but they're not going to do less focus on science under this law than they were before if you sort of take human nature into account.
Okay, so let's not miss an opportunity, basically.
Right, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other look-fors within, as ESSA rolls out, or things that might be abused or unexpected consequences?
Well, so I will tell you, as a STEM advocate, I am more optimistic now than I was when the law was passed for the reasons you just mentioned. If you leave a lot of these decisions up in the air, your mind sort of wanders to what's the worst case scenario. And a lot of states could move the other direction.
No.
But the evidence is not. The evidence is very much in the direction that states are moving to prioritize STEM and science more than they were under the No Child Left Behind era. And the challenge we have is really making sure what's in state plans actually impacts classrooms, because plans are great. They don't necessarily impact what happens tomorrow in your kid's classroom. And so we've got to make sure those plans are followed through with state actions and state budgets, and we've got to make sure Congress funds the law. It's one thing to have a state plan. It's another thing if Congress doesn't fund some of the programs in that new education law this year and in the next years down the line.
Sure.
Okay. So now, thinking about budgeting, we have some federal programs that I think of specifically like title programs, and I have administrators that are a little bit weary stepping into this school year, not knowing where that's headed. Do you have any foresight for them?
Well, so the Congress passed a spending bill earlier this year in April that funded the new education law at about the same levels as it was funded under the prior No Child Left Behind law, with a couple of exceptions. So one of the new funding streams is something called Title IV Part A. It's the Student Success and Academic Competitiveness Grant Program. And it's a program that provides every state and every district with funding for what are called well-rounded educational activities. There's $400 million allocated for this program under ESSA now, under current appropriations. And that's about $130 million more than went out to the states last year under the same sort of, program mix under No Child Left Behind. So there's new money out there that can be spent on STEM education activities like robotics competitions and hands-on learning and improving course content in STEM. And so that's one new funding stream. But the outlook for the next couple of years is much more uncertain in the sense that the Trump administration's first budget proposed eliminating that program. It proposed a boost in Title I funding, but it also proposed eliminating other programs that states intended to use in their state plans to support STEM education. So a little bit of a mixed message, to say the least, in terms of how states are looking to the federal government. And I think we will have a little more clarity a month from now. Congress is going to start debating the spending bills for the next fiscal year that starts on October 1st in the next several weeks, and we should have more idea of where Congress is going to go. I don't think Congress will be nearly as, even in a Republican Congress, will be nearly as austere on education spending as the administration has proposed.
How does a teacher listening find out what their state is doing?
Well, that's actually easier than a lot of people think. So every state has a website now listing their state's ESSA plans.
Okay.
And it's pretty easy to identify, the role of science and STEM education in those plans. There are a number of good analysis for that. Achieve has done a really good analysis. Another group called Education First has done an analysis of what's in those state plans. And so if you get on your browser, it's easier than you think to find out what your state is proposing or is already doing in this regard.
So if you mentioned there, Achieve has done some analysis, that means they're probably looking at aligning it along NGSS ways there?
Yes, and there's definitely a correlation between states that have adopted, all or some of NGSS and their actions under ESSA to prioritize STEM, especially with regard to accountability for science. Those two maps almost look alike.
So hard to predict the Trump administration sometimes, but are there any other markers that you see where science and STEM is heading?
Well, I would keep your eye on some of the next actions out of the White House on this front. We've been hearing a whole lot from the business community that they've really been urging this administration that for competitiveness reasons, the administration needs to put more emphasis on STEM education. And, the White House seems to be trying to figure out how to do that, given that the president has said, we're going to reduce domestic spending because they're concerned about the deficit, and that's their particular direction. But they're also grappling with how do we do something to respond to this need we're hearing from the business community, from others, that's absolutely something we need to do if we want companies to be able to hire more American workers. So they're trying to rationalize two sort of conflicting goals. Domestic spending might be down, but maybe priority on STEM is up in that environment. So we're keeping our eyes on the administration's next round of announcements, because they've gotten through sort of the 6 months of getting these ESSA plans in place and approving all that. It's going to be time for them to articulate their own agenda in the STEM space over the next 6 months.
Well, thank you so much for your time, James. It's an exciting time. It feels like there's this little hope coming through, but also some uncertainty. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in the weeks and years to come.
Well, and thanks for the opportunity here. I have to say, as a concluding thought, STEM education as a policy issue has been bipartisan from the beginning, and despite all the chaos we see in Washington, there's no signs that's going to change.
Awesome.
Good to know.
All right. Well, thanks much, James. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
For links and other information related to this episode, visit laboutloud.com. You can send us your questions and comments at laboutloud.com/contact.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartell.